various events and podcasts I've listened to recently, actually, is in finance. You worked in the private sector for most of your career before making that transition in 2021 into politics, although I think you'd already been involved in some campaigns over the previous years before that. But what was it? Was there a specific issue, a specific moment, a specific conversation even that led you to decide to make that jump from business into politics, into public service?
Yes, yes, and it was very much a Scottish issue because it was all to do with the Scottish National Party trying to rerun the decisive referendum in 2014, which gave a decisive result. They were trying to rerun it in 2021, and I objected to that on the basis that the people of Scotland had spoken in a very strong manner. Out of an electorate of 4.3 million, 3.6 million voted, the highest turnout ever in any election in the Western world, except for Australia, where it's compulsory to vote. So it was an extraordinary level of engagement by Scottish people in that referendum in 2014. 2 million voted to stay in the UK. 1.6 million voted to leave the UK. Absolutely decisive result. And at the time, Alex Salmond quite rightly said that was for a generation. So I was rather affronted when Nicola Sturgeon popped up in 2021 and said that if they won the 21 election at Holyrood, they're going to try and rerun that. So that was the catalyst for me.
Mm-hmm.
That was when the moment I stopped shouting at the telly and said, I'll actually go and get involved.
Very interesting, very interesting. And so then, yes, I know you stood for elections for Scottish Parliament in 2021 unsuccessfully, but then shortly after that, you were made a life peer and appointed to ministerial office under, as I said before, under Boris Johnson. So how did you then find that transition? I mean, you went straight not only into politics, but actually pretty much straight into ministerial office. What was it like moving from a senior role in the private sector in finance to working in quite a different context of the public sector in Whitehall? Was that challenging for you? What did you learn from it?
Well, it was, I mean, the May Holyrood election was a non-event because of COVID. And so there wasn't any campaigning allowed. We weren't even allowed to deliver leaflets. And there certainly wasn't any voter engagement. So it was a complete non-event. So actually standing for Holyrood just didn't really, in terms of trying to get some campaigning experience, didn't happen because we just weren't able to do it. And I just thought to myself, well, c'est la vie. I mean, I wasn't even particularly well known in the Conservative Party because I hadn't even been a member. I think I joined the Conservative Party in 2020. So I wasn't well known to the party and couldn't get myself known to the party or the public. So that I sort of thought that was the end of that. But during COVID, feeling frustrated, being unable to campaign, I just sort of said, I sat myself down and wrote what I thought would be one essay just to say why Scotland should remain in the UK, just to remind ourselves of the reasons. Anyway, that grew arms and legs, as these things do. And next thing, it was 7 essays. And they got picked up by The Spectator, by Reform in Scotland, which then was now called Enlighten, picked up by various CPS, various think tanks, whatever, picked up these pieces. And Alistair Jack, who was then the Secretary of State for Scotland, who I'd met only once before, phoned me and said, look, I know you were wanting to stand as a candidate, and that didn't happen, but we like what you're writing. And he said, in particular around the economy, because we need to fight this idea of a second referendum, and we have to fight it, especially on the economy. So that's when he phoned me up and said, would I come in to help him? And I didn't realise what that meant. And of course, what it meant was I had to then join one of the 2 parliaments. So if one is not elected to the House of Commons, then one has to be selected for the House of Lords, and that's how it came about.
Yeah, no, very interesting. And then, so you've mentioned Alistair Jack already, because you then served as part of his team in the Scotland office, and I'm quite interested in that period because it was a time when I think you've written about it as well and spoken about it, I'm sure as well, when the UK government and Scotland, including the Scotland office most particularly, did shift its strategy in quite a notable way towards what's sometimes called muscular unionism, in which there was a more kind of activist approach to engaging in Scotland, to taking on the Scottish government, perhaps one could put it like that, to passing legislation without Holyrood consent, even if it fell into devolved areas, spending money directly in Scottish communities rather than just passing the money through Holyrood, as was previously the case. I mean, I think I'd be interested in your take now, looking back on that strategy. Do you think it was the right approach, despite the very severe, well, disagreements it led to between the two governments? Or are there things you now wish you'd done differently?
No, it was absolutely the right thing to do. And let me explain how and why. This came about because of Brexit. So with Brexit happening in 2019, when devolution was put through for all the devolved parliaments, there was no, Brexit wasn't contemplated, okay? And so you've got a situation now where you've now got four assemblies, four legislatures in the UK, obviously Westminster, then you get Edinburgh, Cardiff, and Belfast. So how do you create uniformity within that? And that's why the UK Internal Market Act was passed, which was ferociously opposed by the SNP. But the reality is it needs to happen, because you have to create a single market to make sure you get unity within those four legislatures working on one island, one geography, where there's reserved matters and there's devolved matters. And what I always found fascinating was that the SNP hated what appeared to be the UK single market, and yet they spend all the time telling us how much they love the EU single market. The EU single market is a thing they're very, very invested in, and all we were doing was creating a UK single market to make sure that goods and services and people can travel throughout the United Kingdom on a seamless basis. And here's the thing, that when devolution was passed in 1998, the Scotland Act 1998, Scotland was actually run pretty well from Westminster, except it wasn't run from Westminster. It was run from Edinburgh. It was run from St Andrew's House, the Scottish Civil Service. The lines of reporting were into Westminster, but it was run very efficiently in Scotland. That then became devolved. And what happened was that London, Westminster effectively said, it was almost like devolve and forget. We don't need to get involved in Scotland anymore. And so actually, with the combination of the Internal Market Act, and then the other thing was there was a number of EU structural funds. You'll remember when you drive around the Highlands of Scotland or in Wales or in Ireland, you see those EU signs saying this road had been built with the EU structural funds. We then replaced those with UK structural funds, with the Levelling Up Fund. We had the Community Ownership Fund. We had the free ports, we had the city and regional deals. And so we were replacing that money with money direct from London. Again, there was no objections when that came from Brussels, but it appeared that there was some objection when it came from London. The point is that we became the most interactive London, Scotland office in the 25 years of devolution. And when I went to see I went to 32 local authorities to meet the local authorities and the local councillors and leaders. They all said the same thing, which is we haven't seen anyone from London for 25 years. At that time, 20 years. They haven't seen anyone for 20 years. And we're delighted to see you because you've got ideas, you've got money, which is always helpful, and you're talking to us direct. And they've got a level of engagement from London they said they didn't actually get from Edinburgh, which I thought was very ironic. So that was the background to that. And the result of that is that UK got involved in Scotland on a much more direct basis with 32 local authorities, and they welcomed that.
Yes, well, I mean, the funding, of course, would be welcome. I mean, I think the argument that not only the Scottish government, the Welsh government would make as well, is that this led to, or at least could lead to, duplication of functions, because you were from Westminster or Whitehall allocating funding to local growth, local infrastructure projects in quite similar way to the Scottish government's own economic development policy. So I guess the question from my perspective is just whether that leads to the most efficient allocation of resources rather than something that is more joined up or collaborative. Did you have any concerns about that?
The Scottish government do not have development funds, and the Scottish government have reduced funding to the Scottish councils. So if you look over the last 10 years, if you look at the Scottish budget, go through JARS and look at the Scottish budget in Holyrood, the highest single spending department is welfare, which is growing at 15% per annum. And the lowest spending department is local authorities, which is growing at 3% per annum. So the local authorities
Yeah.
were saying they're being starved of money from Edinburgh and London coming in with structural funds, which they were used to having under the EU, where London didn't dictate what projects were chosen. Local authorities chose their own projects. Local people know what's best for them locally, and they were very popular.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, no, that's fair enough. And it's fair to say that the Labour government under Starmer has continued to use those powers, and that has, I think, also led to disagreement with Cardiff and Edinburgh. But clearly, as you say, there's at the local level, the extra funding will always be welcome. Okay, that's useful just to talk about that, because I think those are those are issues that do continue to inspire quite strong views actually at the devolved level. Moving forward then to where we are now. I mean, you've been leader of Reform just for a couple of months. Your decision to join the party, I think, only came or was only announced shortly before that. What was it that led to that decision on your part? I mean, why did you ultimately decide Reform rather than Conservatives offer the best answers to the problems or challenges facing Scotland?
Two reasons. One in London, one in Edinburgh. Let's deal with the Westminster one first. I was in opposition. Obviously, the Conservative Party went into opposition, and I was asked to look at energy to find out why we got into such a difficult place on energy. Why is our energy so expensive in the UK? Why is it 7 times more expensive than China? Why is it 4 times more expensive than the US? Why are we deindustrializing? Why is it that no modern economy can grow without access to cheap energy? And I didn't have any particular skin in that game. I'd gone to COP26. That was the first thing I did as a new minister in 21. And I was generally enthusiastic about the concept of a clean energy system. But it's only when you really get into the detail of it and actually peel back the onion, begin to find out what actually happened, I became quite appalled at what Conservatives had done over 14 years. And the issue within that was that there wasn't consensus within the Conservative Party about how to deal with that. And when I started to stand up in the House of Lords at the dispatch box to start questioning the net zero strategy of 2050, to say that we were doing this too fast, to say there wasn't a just transition at all, to say that we needed to do, we needed that Act of Parliament passed in 2019 in 70 minutes, the Net Zero Act, put into law in 70 minutes without a vote, was just virtue signaling. It wasn't actually based on reality. And that, right now our energy system in the UK is 75% hydrocarbon, 25% non-hydrocarbon. And the idea that you flip that on its head and make it 25% hydrocarbon and 75% non by 2050 is just for the birds. But I got a lot of pushback, and I got a lot of particularly the senior grandees of the Conservative Party, who basically had put that policy through, were not happy. And I just said, this is a divided party. And when you looked at that was energy, then you look at things like the fact that taxation is at the highest level it's been, and borrowing's at the highest level it's been, immigration is at the highest level it's ever been. It just led me to believe this, the Conservative Party's lost its way. And that's from a UK point of view. And then from a Scottish point of view, I was the treasurer and I was talking to donors, treasurer of the Scottish Conservative Party, trying to whip up funds for the Scottish Conservative Party election. And all the donors were saying, well, we can't give you any money until you've got Conservatives in Scotland who've got an ambitious policy for governing Scotland. And the reality is they don't. The Conservative Party in Scotland, by their own admission, have only got one policy, and that's to say no to another referendum. And we're all fed up with that. They're in a sort of codependent relationship with the SNP. So the SNP call for a referendum, and the Conservatives say no to a referendum. In the meantime, public services are not working, and the economy is not growing. And so I was of the view that we need to change. I need to go elsewhere. My ideas here are not welcome. I need to go elsewhere because actually I'm very ambitious for Scotland. We need a growth agenda for Scotland, and that chimed with my conversation with Reform UK.
Yeah, no, very interesting. So you've already therefore touched upon a few specific areas I was keen to dive into now. So let's start with the economy, the need for, you've just put it there, a growth agenda for Scotland. I was reading actually one of those essays you mentioned that you've written previously, in which you described Adam Smith, father of free market economics, as Scotland's greatest export. And I think your view that you've set out pretty clearly in various places is that Scotland's economic performance is being held back by an over large, maybe oversized state. What specifically would you like to cut back? I'm not talking actually just about public spending. I'm talking about regulations, restrictions on business that you think are preventing that spirit of the invisible hands of Adam Smith actually, leading Scotland to the future you'd like to see it.
Well, the interesting thing about Adam Smith is that he was writing 250 years ago, and yet he's still a best-selling author on the economy. In fact, my understanding is he outsells Milton Friedman and Keynes on an annual basis. So it's interesting that his ideas still stand. And his ideas were basically to say there's many ways to solve a problem to make a cohesive society. And there can be state agencies that do that. Obviously, there wasn't a welfare state then, but there was sort of municipal government. But he was also saying that individuals had a role to play. And of course, his invisible hand was about the responsibility that individuals have in their community to do the right thing, right? So if you look at devolution over 25 years, and it's worthwhile always to have a review after 25 years, it's a diamond jubilee. We can look at spending in Scotland. When the Parliament opened in 1999, state spending as a percentage of GDP was then 43%. Okay, and today, 25 years later, it's now 55%. So that's a big increase in a Parliament where anytime there's a problem to be fixed, the mindset of the politicians, centre-left politicians, is to say, there's a problem, we need to spend money to fix it. So we've gone from 43%. By the way, the UK right now overall is 44%. So London would be 35%. UK is 44%. Scotland's 55%. So we've done an experiment in just whatever the problem is, throw more money at it. And the exam question is, have we got better schools? Have we got better roads? Have we got better hospitals? Have we got more cohesive communities? Are we a healthier, wealthier country? And if the answer to that is no, then maybe you might want to say the next 25 years, do something different. And certainly for the next 10 years, I say, let's do something different. And that is therefore to get back to a combination of, yes, the state has got a role to play, but let's empower and encourage and incentivize private individuals to solve some of these problems as well. And that's what we mean about growing the economy.
Okay, and I mean, so I want to come on to your tax plans in a sec, but I mean, are there specific reforms to regulations and rules that apply in Scotland that you'd like to see change to free up business to drive that growth?
Well, one thing is we're living in Quango land up here.
Yeah,
we've now got 132 Quangos. No one really knows what they do. When you talk to businesses who interact with them, they just create bureaucracy, overburdened regulation, and there's a massive overlap between the Quangos and the civil service. We've actually got a Scottish civil service which has within it 29,000 employees, and there's 23,000 employees in the Quangos, right? And there's massive overlap between them. Now, quite apart from the fact you can save money and make things more efficient, you've got a democratic deficit there, where you've now got an increasing number of cabinet ministers standing up in Holyrood when questioned about matters. They say, "Oh, that's run by Quango," as a way out of saying, "Well, we don't have direct line responsibility with that area in transport, in the environment, because it's run by a Quango." And it's just not. It's £6.5 billion being spent, which is basically, I think, shielded from public scrutiny. So, to my mind, let's flatten that. Let's shorten these decision lines. Let's make the civil service more efficient, more responsive, and we're also in a morass of regulation. Planning has got to the point where it's almost impossible to get things through. Talking about year-long delays on basic planning permissions. So we just got a bit sclerotic. It just needs a business. It needs a business eye. Somebody come in and say, "Look, we actually want to make it more efficient, not less efficient. We want to free up the system to allow the economy to grow."
Yeah. Okay. No. Great. And on energy, actually, which you talked about already, I suppose that evolution of your ideas? Is it fair to say in terms of net zero policy? I mean, if you were First Minister, what would you change about Scotland's energy and wider net zero strategy?
So the immediate thing to do, but I need help from London with this because it's a reserve matter. So the weird thing is that energy is a reserve market, quite rightly, because it is something that is governed. The whole 70 million people who live on these islands want a joined up energy policy. That makes a lot of sense. But what we need to be doing is reopening North Sea oil and gas, particularly North Sea gas. We need to be getting the gas going. We're importing 70% of our gas from Norway, okay, from the North Sea fields over the fence from ones that we're shutting down, okay? Even the Norwegian energy minister says that is daft, okay? Now, Reform UK in London are very clear, Richard Tice is very clear that he wants to make that happen. In Holyrood, in the meantime, we can undo some perverse policies. So, for example, this anti-nuclear concept in Scotland, no nuclear in Scotland, we can reverse that because we do need to get nuclear going in the UK, and Scotland needs to play its part in that as well. And because we're producing 20% of wind up in Scotland, we've got a very strong voice on energy policy. We need a balanced scorecard, and we need to get the price of energy down because, as I said before, it's 7 times more expensive than China, 4 times more expensive than the USA.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, great, thanks. And then, yeah, on taxation, I mean, so actually, before going specifically on that, so I believe your manifesto is going to be published this week, this Thursday. Am I right about that? Yes. We look forward to seeing detail because at the moment, I think one of the main bigger policy announcements that you have made is your aspiration to cut income tax. Well, to simplify and cut income tax in Scotland, reversing changes that the SNP have made since income tax powers were devolved 10 years or so ago. So everybody likes lower taxes, but I guess the obvious question is whether you really think that is affordable at the scale you're talking about. I mean, I think it was sort of 2 billion or so in public spending you'd be looking to cut to make the income tax reductions that you're hoping for. And I also saw the Institute for Fiscal Studies analysis of that, which questioned whether you would be able to find the cuts that you were looking for in capital spending because you're limited by the fiscal framework with the Treasury. That's getting a bit technical, but all in all, is that a realistic policy? Can you actually find those savings? And, quangos and so on, the size of the civil service aren't going to find you the billions in savings. It's got to come out of like big public spending programs, doesn't it?
So we've got an overcomplicated tax system. We've now got 6 bands, and if you combine that with the sort of the fiscal drag, we've got an absurd scenario now where what would be considered middle-ranking professions are being dragged into higher tax bands. Whether you're a nurse or a teacher, a policeman, and people are really feeling the pinch. It also creates perverse incentives because, if you are a nurse and you are going to be, if you're going to work extra time and end up going over your threshold, and then you have massive marginal tax rate because not only are you paying more on the additional hours, but you're also getting some other benefits withdrawn. You've got a disincentive to be productive, to work harder, to do extra hours. And we know, for example, in the NHS, there's times when we've got theatre time available, we don't have a work plan, we don't have staff to work in the facilities. So you've got this sort of bizarre, perverse incentive that creates the law of unintended consequences. So let's simplify it, cut it down to 3, and then go 1p below England, right, in the 3 bands. Now, the alignment piece is going to cost 1.2 billion. And then each 1p cut costs 850 million. And our ambition over 5 years would be to get to minus 2p, then minus 3p below, okay? But we start with minus 1p, and we have to fund the initial 2 billion up front. Now, the total spend in Scotland, in JARS, capital and revenue is 117.5 billion. Now, of that, 72 billion is spent in Holyrood. So Holyrood controls 60% of the total spend to keep Scotland going, okay? Of that 72 billion, a 2 billion cut is 3%. It's 3%. I'm doing a lot of hustling with a lot of businesses at the moment, people who run SMEs, people who run their own local businesses, people who run hospitality, etc. And I asked them all, if you had to find some savings in your cost base, could you cut your cost base by 3%? And they all say yes. That is not a scary number. 3% of a total budget is not a scary number. It doesn't need to come from frontline services. So as I said before, there's a whole bunch of ideological spending around net zero environmental, which comes to about $1 billion. We can take some out of that. There is $6.5 billion on the Quangos. Already talked about that. We can take some money out of that. There is savings to be made. If any business person runs a company, would say they can cut 5% of the cost base without necessarily hurting frontline services. And we're talking about 3%. And here's the thing. Why do we do that? And what's the return? Why do we do that? The reason we do that is because out of a population of 5.5 million people in Scotland, we've got 3.6 million of working age. And they divide into 3 groups. We've got 1 million people who don't work. We've got 600,000 who work in the public sector. And we've got 2 million people who work in the private sector. We need to grow the private sector. At the moment, pay is higher and the paying conditions are better in the public sector than the private sector. And in certain cases, if you're able to qualify for a certain number of benefits, you can be better off on welfare than you can working the minimum wage. That seems perverse. If you work, you should always earn more. So we need to get wages up. We need to get skills up. We need to boost the private sector. And the way to do that is to incentivize the people in the private sector to be more productive. So that's why we cut their tax and give them a roadmap on further tax. They will then say, I'm now not being dragged into higher bands in the same way. I'm now able to do more overtime. I'm now able to expand my business. I keep more money in my pocket. And we think if we can get our Scottish economy grows at 1%. I mean, it's just embarrassing. We should be growing at 3%. But if we were to add just 1 extra percent of growth over 10 years, generates 8 billion of additional tax revenues. So for 2 billion down, you get 8 billion back over a 10-year period. That seems like a good calculation. So when politicians talk about growing the economy, they say the words, but they don't know what it means. But what it means is incentivizing the people who work in the economy to be productive.
Okay, no, thanks. That's very clear. And what about immigration? I mean, obviously, it's a sort of key issue for reform at the national level. You've spoken about it as well. Does immigration not bring benefits? Well, what's your assessment? I think this is the question of the balance between benefits and disadvantages that immigration into Scotland is bringing. Because I mean, the Scottish Chambers of Commerce, I think last year said that immigration is an economic necessity without which Scotland risks long-term decline. And the immigration debate's often been quite different in Scotland than England and than the southeast, because there's more space, the demographics are different, population has fallen actually as a share of the UK. So, I mean, how do you weigh that in the Scottish context, and what would you like to see happen?
So the first thing is that on that topic, this is not my assessment, but the public are telling the politicians that this is now a top 3 issue. So the top 3 issues are NHS, cost of living, and immigration. So that's not just being dreamed up by reform. That is now what the people are saying is an issue. And in particular in Scotland, the reason for that, particularly in Glasgow, is Glasgow has now become the biggest asylum centre in the UK. It's got currently holding 6% of asylum seekers. And Glasgow accounts for 1% of the population. And what's happened there is that we've always had a very, very generous welfare system in Scotland. We've always welcomed immigrants in. We've got a very, very good track record of integrating over 75 years. But in the main, they've been hardworking people. They've come in and made a contribution. They've been skilled, and they've added a lot to our economy. The issue we've got is twofold, and it really comes from this thing called the Boris wave that started in 2021 over the last 5 years, where immigration sort of got out of control, frankly, under the Conservative Party. And what it came in was a lot of low-skilled immigration came in. And of that number, whatever that number is, 5 million people, about a third of them are actually on benefit. So that wasn't our previous experience of immigration. Immigration came in, people worked hard and contributed. And the second thing is the illegal piece with the asylum seekers coming in. What's happened here is that in 2022, this is a very Scottish thing. In 2022, the SNP under Nicola Sturgeon removed something called the local connection rule. The local connection rule said for local councils like Glasgow City Council, who are trying to provide services for homeless people, for people at the lower end of our demographic, housing, etc., they had to give priority to those with a local connection. That was cut. And as a result of which have flooded over the border, a lot of the illegals that came to England then worked out they could get free housing and services in Glasgow. And that's what's happened to the detriment of local people. It's just too many, too quickly, too fast. It's just seriously disrupted services in Glasgow city centre and also in the schools and hospitals. It's put a lot of strain on services. And Glasgow city centre, by its own admission, has got a 100 million deficit next year. And they're saying 2/3 of that is coming of dealing with immigration. So there's nothing to be pejorative about. I mean, controlled and skilled immigration is a good thing. Reform supports controlled and skilled immigration. Okay, no question about that. And we want communities to be cohesive. But there's one final little thing to say about this Akash, which is back to the million people we have who don't work. We've got a million people in Scotland who don't work, of working age, right? Now, about half of those will not work because you've got students, you've got adult carers, your early retirees, and you've got seriously long-term disabled. That takes about 500,000. But that leaves 500,000 people who can work if we can help them back to work. But at the moment they've been part-time benefits, they're not getting a hand up to back into work. These people have lost their way. We need to help them. And I'm very passionate about this. We need to help them back into work because they can have a better life working and everyone can do a job. And the best form of welfare I can give anybody is a job. Okay? But if we were to cut, and they would have to come into the workplace and start off probably in the entry-level jobs, maybe the lower skilled jobs, get back into the habit of work, skill themselves up and improve their prospects. If we completely cut that off and give that only to unskilled immigrants from outside, we cut off a very strong pathway, a very important pathway for our own people back to work. So I see this as much as through the lens of economics as much as anything else.
Yeah. Okay, fair enough. I mean, and yeah, as you say, like health-related, disability-related, economic activity, that's a big rising problem across the UK, particularly since COVID. So no, I think your analysis is very interesting to hear. Okay, so we've got a few minutes left, 10 minutes or so, hopefully. So I wanted to put a few questions to you from the audience, if I may. So, I mean, you started off. So here's a question which has been rated the most popular from the online audience about independence, and you started talking about independence as the issue, your opposition to independence, if you like, being the issue that propelled you into politics in the first place, the catalyst. But I think you've also said that potentially in a decade or so, that there might be a moment when it's legitimate to have a second independence referendum. So the question is simply that from Simon Stockwell: does Reform believe there should be another referendum, and in what circumstances?
Well, it's not for me to opine on that or Reform to have a position on it, because that will be down to the will of the people. It's as simple as that. There was an appetite for the referendum in 2014 because a number of things aligned. Now, we don't have a set formula for this, Akash. So we don't have a set formula, but here's what happened. In 2014, number one, Alex Salmond, who then was probably one of the best of his generation as a politician, he won a majority in Holyrood. Bearing in mind, Holyrood was set up to avoid anyone having a majority. He won a majority, number one. Number two, there was appetite in both Westminster and Holyrood to ask the question. Number three, it hadn't been asked for a generation before that. And number four, the polls in Scotland said they wanted to ask that question. Those four things combined to make a consensus around having a referendum in 2014, to which there was a decisive result for a generation. My point about this is that people in Scotland are fed up talking about this. And I've explained to you how public services are not working despite all the money we're spending on it. My proposition is very simply to say, that just take 2 Holyrood terms, that's 10 years. Can we just agree amongst all of us that we're not going to talk about this? And can we actually find common ground that the most important thing is to make Scotland successful? Can we please make Scotland successful inside the UK? I don't know whether in 10 years' time, I don't know. But right now, can we stop talking about it, please? And can we focus on the day job? And the day job is devolved matters to discuss in Holyrood to make Scotland prosperous, happy and healthy.
Okay, so yeah, you said, can we stop talking about that? I know you're talking about the nation as a whole, but I'm happy for us to move on as well to another topic. So a couple of questions. Well, they're both from the same person, actually, Dr. Saoirse Hume, about health. So key public service, as you say, one of the top 3 priorities of Scottish voters. So the first being, well, I'll read the whole question. Given Reform UK's wider messaging around offering an alternative to the status quo, where do you stand on public health interventions to reduce cancer risk, e.g., tobacco control, obesity prevention, alcohol harm reduction? So that kind of public health agenda, some people might see it as sort of nanny state agenda, not putting those words in your mouth. Or do you think that's an important thing that Scottish government should do more of? And then the related question is basically, yeah, so cancer mortality rates are 80% higher in the most deprived communities in Scotland compared to the least deprived. So health inequalities there in that domain. What would you do to address those health disparities?
And I mean, the answer to your question, there's no silver bullet on this, because it would have been fired by now. This is a difficult and practical problem. It's a lot to do with social demographics. At the end of the day, you talk to the medics and the health professionals, everyone would agree, prevention. We should be putting a lot more money into prevention. If you can get the prevention sorted, you will then have a lot less of an expensive system at the back end. And the question is, what line does the state cross to basically start organising people's lives and coercing people to live in a certain way, versus allowing them to make their own choices, right? And that's a very difficult, that's a very pithy argument. We haven't got time to get into that in all ways. I mean, Reform UK instinctively says that we're not here to interfere in people's lives. We're not a nanny state system. But then on the other side, you see, particularly in the lower demographic areas, we've got terrible, shocking health outcomes. I mean, in Glasgow, where I'm speaking to you from right now, you can turn a mile and go to the West End and have a life expectancy of 86. You walk a mile to the East End and have a life expectancy of 66 in the same city, which is just extraordinary. So there's no easy answer to this. But what is clear is the NHS needs a complete reset. It needs to be looked at. Now, we've said that the principles remain that it's free at the point of need and it's paid for general taxation, but it does need to be looked at. And the whole primary versus secondary, prevention versus cure is all part of that. And look, the way to fix this is we have to get round again with the medics and the health professionals and work this out on a consensual basis.
Okay, great. So there's lots and lots of questions. I wouldn't ordinarily do this, but Malcolm, could I just check how long you actually have? Because we've got literally 40 questions. I'm not going to be able to take all of them, but I'd like to ask you a few more if I may.
Well, I've got another appointment outside of this building at 1:30, so I can probably do another 5 minutes at a stretch.
Okay, let's try and quickly rush through a couple more then. So here's one from someone who's, I can't read the full name, Thomas somebody. Scottish universities have global reputations. How would your policies support their international influence and their ability to attract global talent? And maybe just so we can get through a couple, there's also one on the civil service. Do you have any plans for civil service reform in Scotland if you were to be in government? That's anonymous questioner.
So the civil service one first, I've spoken about that in the context of 29,000 civil servants and 23,000 quangos. There's too much overlap and duplication. We need to reform that. And I think the civil service will welcome that anyway, because I think people want to have more productive jobs, not less productive jobs. People don't want to work in silos. They want to work in a joined up system. So we can deal with that. I think all the parties are now agreeing on that. In terms of universities already are punching above their weight. I always say in Scotland, we have 8% of the population and 33% of the geography. So whatever we do, it needs to be above 8%, as close as possible to 33%. And there's all sorts of sectors that we have that, whether it's 20% of energy, whether it's 20% of UK food and drink. The universities are something like between 13 and 15% research grants go to Scottish universities, punching above our weight. We have a huge international student body, again, punching above our weight. So the universities are actually doing very well, but again, their funding settlement from the Scottish government has not been as generous as it should be, and as a result, and you might argue, have we got too many universities? Question mark. We're now sending 50% of young people to university. Every barman in Glasgow, every barman in Edinburgh's got a degree, and yet we're short of really good technical jobs. And we've starved our college sector. Should we, in fact, actually be rebalancing for this new economy we're talking about, this economy we want to grow? Should we be rebalancing the economy so we got more like 50% of kids going to colleges with real apprenticeships attached, getting into meaningful jobs that will not be taken away by AI? Whether you're a very highly skilled welder or a gas engineer or a chef, that's not going to be taken away by AI. And should we actually be rebalancing that sector? And my view is we should definitely be looking at that. But there's no question that in terms of our research based in Scotland, we're punching well above our weight.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great, thanks. Right, so a couple of interrelated questions on, relating to the debate about immigration and cultural cohesion, I guess. So I'll read out as put. This is, what our audience is asking. So the first is, why does Mr. Offord, why do you use phrases such as illegals to refer to people seeking asylum who have a legal right to be in the country? Do you recognise that this sows division in our communities? And a related question from someone else anonymous: what will you do and what will Reform do to bridge divide and build greater cohesion and unity within Scotland's communities?
Okay, so this will be the last question. You've got to go.
Absolutely.
So the reason why I use that is because that's what the individuals themselves, how they describe themselves. So I've met them, I've been to see them. And in fact, from here, I'm going back down to the homeless shelter in Glasgow and Glasgow Street, where the illegal asylum seekers come in and they are given shelter and provision. And they have paid to come here. They have not come through a legal system. And that is just a fact. That's just the reality. And the reason they come to Glasgow is to get free board and lodging. So I don't think it's particularly inflammatory, just to say what is actually happening. As far as cohesion is concerned, we've got a very good track record in Scotland of cohesion. But what I said to you earlier is that the speed and scale and size of this influx has taken everyone by surprise, and the services are struggling to cope with it. And when you've got a situation where not everyone speaks English as their first language, it's difficult to achieve that in terms of integration. So the answer to that question is to look at the past. We have a proud track record of community cohesion, diverse communities. We've done that in the past. We can do it again in the future. But right now, the conditions of this don't apply because the pressure is too great right now. It needs to be, and that needs to be fixed. Don't blame the individuals, blame the system. The system is broken and needs to be fixed.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks. Yeah. So obviously don't want to make you late for your next appointment. So just wanted to say thanks again for taking the time to speak with us. To all our audience, thanks for tuning in and for the questions. Apologies to those we haven't had time for. That's it from the Institute for Government today. Malcolm, hope to have the opportunity to speak with you again in future. And all the best. Thanks to everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Akash.